Well, welcome back, everybody. I am here with Mr. Pieter Cleppe of the Brussels Report, and it's very good to speak to you today, Peter.
Likewise, it's great to be on.
So, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the rise of certain European parties that we've seen in the past year. Obviously, the Sweden Democrats had a historic result. Also, Giorgia Meloni's party in Italy, Viktor Orban, he's been in power for a long time, but he had a good result this year as well. And so, what I want to ask you is, are these things, in your view, isolated incidents, or are we starting to see a European-wide trend towards more conservative governments?
I do think we can speak of a trend. There's clearly a lot of discontent regarding the incumbent political parties that have, I would say, been conducting social democratic policies. Big spending, not really going with tax cuts or deregulation or economic reform. When it comes to migration, tolerating a relatively high degree of chaos. And I do think what we're seeing in Europe is that people are moving more to the right, in the sense that they want, migration to be brought under control. They are deeply unhappy with, of course, energy prices. And I do think we see the first signs of the green parties that are, of course, behind the whole energy crisis. Their philosophy was adopted by all the mainstream parties. The idea to stop investing in European fossil fuels, for example. And to make us more dependent on authoritarian neighbors. And then, you see what happens when these authoritarian neighbors cut us off. Those kind of ideas are, I think, losing a lot of support among the population in Europe, thankfully. And that's definitely one of the reasons why we see, indeed, particularly in Sweden and in Italy, a great victory of the right.
Do you think that the incumbent governments across Europe generally understand that? Because I was speaking to a parliamentarian here in this country who's a member of the government party, and he was telling me that while he doesn't like these parties that are coming to power in places like Italy and Sweden, he says he understands that it's the failure of parties to address things like law and order and so on that are driving people into the arms of the Viktor Orbans and the Giorgia Melonis of Europe. Do you think that generally there's an understanding there among the European establishment that this is what's happening?
Well, every country in Europe is different, but particularly in Sweden, I do think that the government that was just defeated, they understood it, because the Swedish Social Democrats, they had sort of made a turn to a more firmer immigration policy. But it was too little too late. The damage had been done. A lot of chaos in migration made sure that, you have this crime wave in Sweden that is clearly linked to immigrant gang violence. Now, don't get me wrong. I think immigration is a great thing. It can be very enriching, but I think it has to happen in an orderly manner, and clearly in Sweden, it has been way too quick. I think people have ended up living amongst each other. There's not enough integration, and similar problems you see all across Europe. In my own country, in Belgium, of course, where we had terrible terrorist attacks back in 2016. At some point, people are abandoning sort of the mainstream parties that have been responsible for this, even if, to answer your question, they have been, understanding that they have to change tack. In Denmark, even if that government has just collapsed, but the Danish Social Democrats have been extremely successful. They have gained a lot of voters from the Danish People's Party, which was the right-wing populist, right-wing conservative alternative. But many of these voters that used to vote for the anti-establishment have returned in Denmark to the Social Democrats, because the Danish government is is trying to outsource asylum processing. It's it has concluded the deal with Rwanda. We'll have to see in practice if they're able to implement it. To basically ask people to apply for asylum in Rwanda. Far from perfect, but the idea is that you can only enter the territory after you have received a yes. It's a little more complicated in Denmark because they actually want to give these people asylum in Rwanda. There's pros and cons, but the main idea, I think, is very, very good, which was successfully applied by Australia, which is, look, I mean, you just can't enter illegally on the territory. That's just whatever happens. If we have a lot of migration or little, this is just clearly a bad idea. This is helping human smugglers, and Australia managed to break the back of these human smugglers by telling people, look, you have to apply for asylum outside of Australia. You just can't enter the territory and then see if you get a yes or a no. And the same model is adopted by the UK. The European Commission in Brussels is very hostile to this idea, but perhaps with Sweden and the new Italian government pushing for this, this may actually go somewhere. To also get back on your question, in Italy, I think there was probably we had Mr. Mario Draghi in charge there. So I don't think he had really picked up the signs of the population, at least not when it comes to immigration. Also, not when it comes to the energy crisis. Italy has great gas reserves. The Greens are against using these gas reserves, and that's the end of the story. All the mainstream parties go along with that, terrible idea. Even if I would be against fossil fuels, and I'm not, even then I would find it very strange that we only phase out European fossil fuels and then we import from places like Russia or Qatar or Algeria.
Didn't we hear recently that Europe is buying Russian gas from China at a premium, that they've just marked up the price considerably, but it's the same gas that's just been funneled through Asia?
I would say gas, not yet, but definitely that's the case for oil, documented. And energy experts expect that this is, the reason why the energy crisis is probably not going to last 10 years, as the Belgian Prime Minister speculated, but it should be a maximum 3 years, because indeed we're going to end up, buying Russian gas through China. Now, don't get me wrong. This is a terrible mistake, I think, by Russia, by Putin, to cut off his main customer, because the gas that we're going to buy from Russia through China is not the same gas as the gas that we have been buying so far. It's not so easy to just, tinker around with these gas fields. The pipelines are all oriented towards Europe. And basically, to make a long story short, Putin has cut off Europe and Western Europe in terms of gas. And in a very optimistic scenario, he will be able to sell 25% of the amounts he was selling to Europe in the future to Asia. So this is only some kind of a relief. So at the end of the day, we'll have to find a solution. The Economist, a mainstream magazine, it's good to see that, urged the Netherlands to open up its Groningen gas reserves. This is not just the biggest gas reserve of Europe, this Dutch gas reserves in the north of Holland, but it's also one of the biggest in the world. And it's just puzzling that the Dutch government is not deciding to sort of restart gas exploration there. Well, it's happening to a very a modest extent, but it used to happen at full force. And we have a massive gas crisis. We have massive gas shortages. All our infrastructure for housing is oriented at gas, and still, you see these governments this Dutch government following the logic of the Greens. And also there, we see parties like D66, they call themselves left liberal, but make no mistake, I think they're even more green than the Greens and more left than some left-wing parties. They are behind this. They want to also spend an astronomical 20 billion euro to sort of buy farmers to stop farming. That's why you had the big farmer protests in the Netherlands early this year, which I think is also tying into this content. I don't want to simplify, but there is a certain trend. Something is afoot in Europe. I also saw in Ireland that there's this European Commission attempts to ban Ireland also and restrict it in terms of its energy provision, it's in terms of its agriculture. And you can see also in Ireland. I mean, your medium has also highlighted this. You can see some protest against that as well. People they don't like this top-down economic management,
particularly in Ireland, considering the fact that we have a colonial history. We fought for however many centuries to gain our independence from Britain. And now I feel like there's a growing section of the population in Ireland who think, well, wait, what was all that for if we're now just going to be told that we can't even use our own natural resources within our country by this foreign bureaucracy that has nothing to do with us,
Exactly. And I mean, like, personally, I think the EU is still, despite all its downsides, it's a good thing. It's a framework to open up trade in Europe. I always call all the good aspects of Europe the Ryanair Europe. Ryanair is an Irish company offering great services to the middle classes of Europe, enriching their lives in a fantastic way, bringing competition. And that's the real Europe. That's the real EU. But sadly, we see less and less of that. Try to buy a car in another European country. It's a bureaucratic hassle. The European Commission is not trying to focus on that. Instead, it's coming up with all kinds of plans to, if it's not controlling health and vaccine policy, it's controlling energy policy, or it's proposing yet another, big transfer scheme at the European level. And Ms. von der Leyen, the president, I mean, like, I think she's the biggest Eurosceptic in Europe. She, like, her actions and the actions of the top ranks of the EU Commission bureaucracy, because these are the ones really calling the shots more than the European commissioners. I don't think they're pro-European. I don't think they're doing their own, project, which is fundamentally good, a great service by pushing for ever more concentration of money and power in Brussels. I mean, this is anti-European, and you can see people revolting against this.
Well, speaking of Ms. von der Leyen, I believe that in the run-up to the Italian election, she made some comments regarding we have some tools to deal with the election if it goes a certain way, and many people interpreted that as almost a threat of sanctions. I believe that Hungary was sanctioned for electing Viktor Orban. And so whether that's what she meant or not, I'm not a mind reader, but a lot of people viewed it as this is a kind of intimidation almost to the Italian voters. So I guess I'm wondering, do you think that these movements that we're starting to see are a threat to the European Union as a bloc? Where do you think the EU is going to be in 10 years' time if we continue on this trajectory?
Von der Leyen is indeed, like, she was clearly referring to the Hungarian and Polish treatment, using the word tools, so as if it were like some kind of torture tools just before the Italian election. You can't make it up. Like I mean, she's not the greatest political genius, to put it politely. So I think where is the EU ending up in 10 years? Well, if bureaucracy continues its path, there's going to be a lot more and more hostility towards the EU. People are just going to mix up all the good things with all the bad things, sadly, which is what happened in Britain. I was deeply involved in the British EU debate. I've been representing a British EU think tank here in Brussels for 12 years. And we always try to make clear, look, it's important to reform the EU, listen to the British. They have legitimate concerns. Of course, people like Angela Merkel completely ignored this. Also, the leaders of the Benelux. The only ones that made an effort were, was the Polish government that actually tried to keep the United Kingdom on board. This failed. The UK public had enough of it, and I do think, especially in Scandinavia, you see a trend towards that as well, particularly in Denmark, which is the most Eurosceptic country and not a member of the Eurozone. So I think if we see the next exit, it will be in Scandinavia. I think in Ireland, there's this content, but There's also, for the sort of the crave for independence from Britain, that will always serve as an argument, I think, in Ireland in favor of the EU. But there's a limit to that. The EU is also attacking successfully the Irish low corporate tax rate. Taxes are something close to the heart of democracy. Absolutely no business for a supranational bureaucracy in Brussels, but still they try to, and they manage to affect this. However, one very important thing when you're talking about what is the future of the EU is, I think, the future of the euro. And we are entering a deep recession, unfortunately, self-inflicted largely, because of the energy experiments, phasing out nuclear power as well, phasing out domestic fossil fuel production. So we are losing our manufacturing basis as we speak, which is terrible. Because it didn't have to be like that. Now, I think we can, if we take the right measures, we can correct everything, of course. I don't want to be too pessimistic, but this will all have a great effect on the stability of the euro. And the European Central Bank is already witnessing 9 or 10% inflation. So you would think, well, they can always print to keep, Italy, the Italian government afloat, or the Spanish government. But that's not the case, because the ECB can only control how much money they pump into the system, but they cannot control to what extent people that save in euro trust the euro. So what we're already seeing is capital flight from the Eurozone. I mean, to be fair, the same is happening in Japan and the United Kingdom. In favor of the American dollar, which is, of course, the world reserve currency. It makes perfect sense to seek some shelter there. But particularly in Europe, a lot more printing will sadly be needed if you want to keep the Eurozone together, because politicians will never agree to mass transfers. Well, they are agreeing to transfers, but not to the extent that is necessary to keep this whole artificial construct alive.
Do you think the governments of Europe implementing such stringent lockdown measures and all of the bailout funds that came with that, do you think that has contributed to the economic situation we're in now?
Absolutely, absolutely. You can't just switch the economy on and off, and maybe politicians believe that, but in the real world, that's not possible. I think the only measure for COVID that was probably justified was stringent border checks, at least in Taiwan, which was just close to China. They managed to keep COVID out for a long time. They did not implement the lockdown, only stringent border checks. We followed the policies of the Chinese Communist Party, believe it or not, in the West, even in the States to a degree. These terrible, horrific lockdowns have, of course, apart from all the human rights they have violated, they have not done much to help COVID. If you compare to Sweden, you have a perfect, test case there. Sweden was not materially different in terms of COVID damage than the rest of Europe. These lockdowns were unnecessary, and they have done great damage. Also, fiscally, our governments in Western Europe have spent a lot of money. They have used a lot of capital and increased public debt to a great degree. So that today, with this massive energy crisis that we have, it's the firepower has been used up to a degree. So that's another effect of these lockdowns, and we're still. I mean, people don't talk about it anymore because we have now the next crisis on our hands. It's not exactly the Roaring '20s as some people had predicted, this is. The lockdowns are part of the reason why our economy is in deep trouble. Now, again, I don't want to be too pessimistic. I think if we stop our energy experiments, if we stop giving all these subsidies to unreliable wind and solar, we reopen our nuclear power plants, we allow fossil fuel production in the Netherlands, in Italy, and other places. We consider shale. Shale is not perfect. Every energy source, including wind and solar, are damaging for the environment. Nuclear is probably the very best for the environment, but you also need gas and coal probably in your mix. So, you know, there's not a free lunch. We can all, you know, we can reduce our living standards. Yeah, then we're not damaging the environment. But if we want energy, we need to sadly damage the environment to a certain degree. And of course, we need to absolutely try to keep this at the minimum. But there's estimates like in UK administration that shale is actually less damaging to the environment than traditional gas exploration. So this is all very complex. It all depends on the situation. But at least now we're importing a lot of American shale gas at 10 times the price of what used to be the price for gas in Europe. So this does not make any sense. So at least in Bavaria, the prime minister there has said that he wants to reconsider the ban on shale. We have lots of shale opportunity here in Europe. Also in the United Kingdom, of course, the new government of Miss Liz Truss is also, you know, ending the ban on shale. Of course, she wants local consent, and that's very important. That's the reason, you know, in the Netherlands, the reason why politicians are afraid to, you know, to restart with Dutch gas exploration for real is because the local population is very angry at the politician, because some people had some damage to their houses as a result of the gas exploration, and they have not been properly compensated. But like with the astronomical profits coming from Dutch gas exploration, the Dutch government could easily and fairly compensate people for, you know, for all the damage. But, you know, none of that is happening. You know, our politicians are not brave. You know, they're hoping the crisis is going to go away. But if you don't do anything, the crisis is not going to go away. You know, we just have to, energy is the basis of our economy. We should not play with it anymore. We should not have 16-year-old Swedish schoolgirls suggesting how to run our energy policy. I mean, that's quite telling, like how much serious her advice was taken. So yeah, like, and also financially, it's very simple. Like European welfare states cannot afford the kind of spending levels unless if people don't want to pay the taxes that are needed to finance that. And people clearly do not want to pay the taxes that are needed for the amounts of welfare spending that we have. So then the only logical conclusion is that we need to have less welfare spending. And I'm pretty sure that's also what's going to happen.
And especially when you take into account the fact that Europe has such an aging population, you have this bigger and bigger tax burden that's falling on a smaller and smaller workforce. And that's true across almost all European countries, or possibly all European countries at this point. I was also going to ask you about the Nordstream apparent sabotage. And obviously it's pure conjecture. We don't know for sure what happened there exactly, and everybody has all these theories. What do you think is the situation there? Because it seems to me like it would be unlikely that Russia would be the culprit, because you don't see how that would benefit them. It also seems unlikely that the European Union would be involved in that. It would seem very much like cutting off your nose to spite your face. It's a rather tricky one. I don't know what your thoughts are on that whole incident.
I think the truth is we don't know. But I'm happy to speculate. It could be the KGB or whoever they're now called, the FSB. You know, the reason for Russia to do this, or for Gazprom to do this, is that then they have like an excuse to be able to cut off the gas. You know, if ever there's a big court case at arbitration courts, you know, because the Energy Charter Treaty requires private arbitration courts to settle this, then Gazprom could say, oh, well, yeah, but we had something like force majeure. You know, we had no other way than to cut off the gas. That's one theory. You could say, well, the US has always been openly hostile to Nord Stream, so it's the CIA who did it. It's Joe Biden and his team. Honestly, I don't know. Clearly, Europe is not profiting from it, so it's probably not a European power who did it. It's clearly an act of sabotage, at least according to Swedish expert. It's not some kind of an earthquake. So yeah, that leaves Russia or the United States. What I read is that Russia is not particularly helpful in order to get to the bottom of this. that's maybe an indication. Could be Russia, but again, the US has been super openly opposed this, Nord Stream. The strategy of Putin is to try to, cut off the gas in the hopes that European politicians will then push Ukraine to do some dirty deal with Putin. So you could say, oh, the US is trying to prevent that by blowing up these pipelines. Yeah, it's a theory, but I feel it's like there's so much speculation
and no doubt, propaganda is omnidirectional, flying back and forth everywhere.
Everywhere. I do think the honest answer is we don't know. We don't know.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Pieter. Really, really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.